I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Spandrew Spice.
Welcome to Deep Cuts, the podcast where we pick a topic and walk you through the ins, the outs, and the nitty-gritty so you can appear like an interesting and idiosyncratic person at your next forced social function. Today's topic is...
André Stander.
Who is André Stander? Well, for much of his life, Stander was an unassuming citizen who, nonetheless, rose to the rank of captain in the South African police force during the era of apartheid. As the folk legend usually goes, he grew disillusioned with the racist regime and began robbing banks as a way to stick it to the system. But was he actually a freedom fighter who realized he was part of the problem? Or was he just a bored nepo baby who felt like robbing some banks?
André Charles Stander was born on November 22, 1946 in Transvaal, South Africa, to Anna Jacomina Stander and Major General Francois Jacobus Stander of the South African Prison Service. André Stander came of age during the age of apartheid in South Africa, where white South Africans implemented an institutionalized form of racial segregation to keep them separate from black South Africans. The Standers were white, and Francois in particular was well regarded within the police system, a legend among the ranks who always thought his son would follow in his footsteps. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but this is a picture, a mugshot of our boy André Stander from a little later in life.
André Stander looks like a substitute math teacher from the mid-'80s who decided to start huffing paint, then got in trouble for maybe getting a little too friendly with some of his students.
André Stander looks like he was devastated when Peter Gabriel left Genesis and Phil Collins replaced him.
André Stander looks like the type of guy who gets home late at night after working as a bouncer at a strip club, sits in front of a TV in a love seat that has like duct taped holes, barely holding itself together, and buys those like pop best of the 60s CDs off of like infomercials.
André Stander looks like he at one point bought the biggest TV you've ever seen in your life, and every guest he has over, he sits and walks them through the entire process of when he bought it every time. Tells him about like the conversation he had with the Best Buy salesperson, brags about like a $30 rebate he actually sent in and got back every time. And you go over and you're like, yeah, you've told me this 4 times.
André Stander looks like the type of guy that is on a first name basis with the clerk at the local VHS pornography store.
André Stander, incidentally, does not look like a highly decorated police officer who ends up becoming a bank robber.
André Stander looks like the type of guy that keeps money at the back of his fridge in a jar that has live ammunition in it.
Yeah. André Stander looks like somebody who has like 4 shelves of Precious Moments ceramic figurines on his wall. And then people come over and they're like, oh, your wife collects Precious Moments. And he's like, oh, yeah, my wife.
André Stander looks like the type of guy who gets in fist fights with people in Safeway parking lots.
Yeah, that's pretty spot on because that like perfectly describes this weird middle ground where he looks like he gets in fights, but he does not look like a tough guy at all.
Yeah, it looks like all of those fights are like rooted in weakness.
Yeah, he looks like a Gen X, slightly new age, hippie-ish, Northern Californian person. Somebody who lives up in Santa Cruz.
But which is weird because now he talks like this and he's got a crazy accent. This is not South African. This is a New Zealand accent.
New Zealand and South African accents sound very similar. And actually, I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but I went to the theater with the author of this episode, Mike Bedard, who wrote the script for this episode we're about to get into. I went to see Edge of Tomorrow, or as it should have been called, and what it was originally titled, All You Need Is Kill, which is a way better name than Edge of Tomorrow. And then they ended up like weirdly swapping the title with the tagline. And whenever it came out on video, they changed it to Live, Die, Repeat, which is also not a good title.
It's better than Edge of Tomorrow, though.
It's better than Edge of Tomorrow, but still, All You Need Is Kill is a great title. But we were waiting for the movie to start, and there was two guys, and one of them, he was South African, and he was talking to his buddy. They were both like animators or something like that. They were just talking about like animation industry stuff. And then a different guy with an accent that sounded similar kind of went and sat next to them, and he was like, I can't do it. Like, the accent you just did is pretty good. I'm not going to be able to do an accent.
Why don't you just try? Just humor me. Just try for me.
He was like, hey, mate, are you a Kiwi or are you a Southie or whatever he said? And he was like, oh, I'm from New Zealand. And he was like, oh, yeah. And he was a South African guy. And he went up and he just started talking to him. And he was like, are you from New Zealand or are you from South Africa? And he's like, oh, I'm from New Zealand. And he's like, oh. And so it was funny because that was like a 50-50 shot to where he could sit there and like have a conversation with this guy and relate to him about a bunch of stuff. But it failed. Like, he failed the critical role on that one. And it came out like, oh, this guy is not from the same country as you. But then he just kept talking to them. And it was like, you could tell he meant to go over there and like strike up this conversation and have all these nostalgic discussions with this guy. And then it was wrong. It was the wrong country. And then he just stuck around, and you could tell the other two guys were just like, you don't need to keep talking to us. This could end. But he just committed to it. We got there early, and it was like one of the most uncomfortable 15 minutes of conversation I've ever overheard. The only problem was André didn't have much interest in following his father. But after failing the matric, the high school graduation exam, and something that should have been a gimme for a privileged white South African at the time, he decided to enroll in Pretoria Police College. André graduated at the top of his class in 1963, something that didn't sit right with his classmates, with many suspecting his well-connected father pulled some strings. This suspected nepotism continued to seemingly follow André as he rose to the rank of captain for the Kempton Park Criminal Investigation Department in the early 1970s. I was thinking about that whenever I read this, because that's always portrayed in movies as very romantic. A cop who's like the son of a cop. There's always like a cop character in movies where it's like his dad was a cop, and he'll have these conversations with like, your dad was a good man. And they'll have this like deep conversation about how his dad was like this great cop, and then he's like following in his footsteps. Or maybe it's the opposite and he's like disappointing his dad or something like that.
It's always a fucking Boston accent. Your dad was a great cop. We loved your dad on the force, but then he parked his car in Harvard Yard.
They say that every time, in every movie. It's really weird.
We fucking loved your dad, but then he parked his car in Harvard Yard. Coming this fall. No! Harvard Yard.
And obviously I'm aware of the concept of propaganda, like I can intellectualize it, but I've just never thought about that. But this makes a good point, which is like, it's not romantic at all. It's just like nepotism. It's just like a dad who's a cop, and he's just like, park the car of an A+ in my son's Harvard Yard. It's not really romantic. It's literally just like, oh, there's like a dad, there's like a cop on the force, and then he just like helps his son get on the force, which in that particular type of job, you should be qualified to have the job. Like, of all the jobs in the world, that's not one you should get by nepotism.
Yeah. But you're right, though. It's such a trope, because I think in America, we think of like a, moral high ground and the way morals are passed on as a deeply familial thing. Like, it's not necessarily something that's inbred in our culture or just inherent in our culture. We think of it as there's a nurture there, not a nature, and we really want our previous generation to pass on the best of what they have to offer to the next generation. And in crime fiction and pulpy kind of propaganda-y stories, that manifests as either our main character has to live up to the legacy of the previous generation, which he can never do, or your dad was a good cop until he wasn't anymore, 'cause he parked his car in the wrong part of Harvard Yard. And then our guy has to figure out how to navigate that and be better than his parents, right? So there's a part of that I think is probably, metatextually related to the American identity and what we perceive as a life well lived and a moral compass that is, for lack of a better term, a just moral compass. But this motherfucker's South African, so I don't know.
Yeah, who fucking knows what's going on over there?
I wish I could do the actual accent so I could think of other words that rhymed. If I was really good at riffing right now, I would do the Hippocrates Ka and Harvard Yard, but I would do it with sounds and vowel sounds related to the South African accent. But I don't know what the South African accent. I mean, I know it when I hear it, but I can't do it.
It's just what Chappie sounds like.
Oh, career ending?
Yes. I mean, career ending. More like career continuing to careen off into oblivion.
I mean, it basically was career ending. Like, that movie is the reason he didn't get to do Alien 5, and it's the reason he self-funded all of these indie short films, and then self-funded the shitty fucking horror movie that's all AI-driven, and then forced him to take a studio gig directing a video game movie that he obviously had no passion for. So yeah, I would count that as career ending.
Well, it might have been the final nail in the coffin, but my point is that Neil Blomkamp just might be the most unlucky filmmaker ever. And maybe not. Maybe he's very lucky because he continues to keep getting chances. I don't know how that shakes out. But my point is that he made District 9. It was a huge hit. And then just literally never again. No movie he's ever made has ever gotten him back into the good graces.
Yeah, it's really a shame. He's also South African, so this is vaguely in theme with what we're talking about. But it's really a shame that, like, I don't know. I would rather talk about that than talk about this. I'm fascinated by his career, and I actually just recently rewatched Elysium, District 9, Chappie, and a bunch of the short films, and I couldn't bring myself to watch the direct-to-DVD thing or Need for Speed, or no. Gran Turismo.
I liked Gran Turismo okay. And actually, I just have to tell you because I'm not going to do it anymore. I was working on an episode about the Gran Turismo story, and I ended up deciding not to because the real life story is just enough not as interesting as the movie version that eventually I kind of felt like I was treading water a little bit, where I was like, oh, well, this didn't quite happen the way that they said it in the movie, and it's not quite as cool. It was like a stack of that until I was like, actually, the real life story isn't that interesting. They really dramatized it for the movie. It's still interesting enough as a fact that a kid like joined a contest to race cars and he never raced cars before. To the listener, there's a true story about a young British teenager who was a huge gamer. He played Gran Turismo like obsessively, and he was like one of the best players in the world. And there was a contest where it was like a gimmick where they were like, hey, the best Gran Turismo players in the world come and race real cars. And then he like joined this competition and raced in a real race with a real car, and he won. And then he ended up becoming like a real race car driver, and he's like a very good race car driver that's like, he's been in the industry for like 10 years at this point. The movie version of it was directed by Neil Blomkamp, and it was very dramatized, and the real life story is just subtle enough that I realized it just wasn't going to be a good episode. Because we're not doing that episode, I just have to tell you that the intro for the episode, I wrote a line in it, which was, you may have heard this story already because of the fact that a Hollywood film was produced about it, but probably not because movie-going audiences, or perhaps God, hate Neil Blomkamp. That was in the intro. I think it's my favorite intro line I've ever thought of for one of these episodes, but we're not going to do the episode.
We should just do a retrospective on Neil Blomkamp's career, and then we can just put it back in again. Fuck Chappie. That movie's dog shit.
While his resume was impressive, André didn't exactly have the admiration of his peers. During the height of his eventual crime spree, one of his old colleagues, Chris Swanepoel, said to the press,
You know, we read every day of the brilliant student who was forced on the road to robbery. Brilliant? How could he be brilliant and still fail matric? Sure, he was a captain of the police, but was he a brilliant detective? Rubbish, I say. When we were in the force together, he couldn't even catch a cold.
Brutal takedown. Chris Swanepoel was not holding anything back. He's like, I got a jug of tea, and I'm not even adding sugar. I'm just chugging it. Things weren't much more fulfilling for André in his personal life either. In the late 1960s, André married Leonie Becky Beeslar, but they divorced in 1972. André then began a relationship with a teacher, Pat Amos, and they had a child together named Ernie. However, André had zero relationship with the boy, and Ernie didn't even know that the infamous André Stander was his father until he was 21 years old. After leaving Pat and Ernie, André remarried Leonie, but it didn't take long for things to go on the rocks yet again. By 1977, André was 31 years old. He may have had a good job, albeit one tainted with possible and, let's be honest, likely nepotism. Plus, he was on his way to divorcing his wife for the second time, and he didn't have a ton of friends on the police force. His only real pal was a guy by the name of Carl Van Deventer, an agent of the Bureau of State Security. If André was a protagonist in a 90s movie, this would be the part of the story where he starts a fight club or realizes he's the chosen one. Anything to break him out of the mundanity of having a good job and a wife he probably just needed to listen to sometimes. André's solution? Start robbing banks. André's crime spree began in 1977. The day began like any other, where André gave out assignments to the rest of the force. With nothing for him to do, he drove to Jan Smuts Airport on his lunch break to travel to the city of Durban. Man, fucking Star Wars comes out. The Misfits drop their seminal album. What's the album that has Last Caress on it? That came out in 1977, I think. And our boy André is out here, and he's just like, I'm gonna rob a bank.
Those banks, they got too many dollars in there. Those dollars need to be out on the street or the people. It's a fucking New Zealand accent. I can't do a South African accent.
These dollars, they gotta be out because of racism?
I bet you that there's some sort of South African slang for that, though. Like, we gotta take these dollars out for a Jimmy Waller. Which is like slang for bank robbery. I don't know. That's more Australian. We gotta make sure these dollary dues don't end up with the dollary U's.
I don't know what South Africans say. I'm a hypothetical caricature of myself being created by a random American guy.
Our two New Zealand and Australian listeners are gonna hate this episode. They're gonna be like, don't slander us. We don't sound anything like that.
It's funny because we were doing the bit about the Boston accent because it starts to sound like JFK.
Yeah, it does. 89 Berliner.
Ask not what these dollary dues will do for you, but what they'll do for Harvard Yard.
Ask not what these Harvard Yards will do for you, but these parks can do for you in the wrong part of Harvard Yard.
It's just fucking unhinged. He got a car and put on a disguise, which amounted to a wig and a fake beard, and drove to the bank. He had also brought a handgun with him on the flight because you could really just do whatever the fuck you wanted to back in the day. André walked up to a teller, pulled a gun on her, and told her to fill a bag with money. He ran off after the haul, and even after the teller triggered the silent alarm, he was already gone. He got a flight back to Johannesburg and got back to his station before the day was even over, with a bag of money still in his car. André was hooked, and it's believed that between 1977 and 1980 that he robbed nearly 30 banks, making off with 100,000 rand over the years. That's a lot of money, and he spent it in ways that should have raised some alarms if he wasn't a white guy living in apartheid South Africa. This is the first part when we get to this kind of crossroads, where we've heard everything leading up to this. We've heard André's life, we've heard his story, we've heard how he got to where he's gotten to. And we've also heard the premise of this, which is this cop who got fed up with the racism in apartheid South Africa and decided to start robbing banks as like some form of protest or something. Does that sound like what is happening?
No.
To me, it just sounds like a guy robbing banks.
Yeah, to me, it just sounds like a shitty rich kid who's just like, I need to get me some more money. I want a house. I'm going to buy me a house with all this rand.
Yeah, and also, like, he was just robbing banks for, like, 3 years straight. That's, like, a crazy streak. Like, you know, the thing that you don't always put into context whenever you hear these stories about, like, notorious criminals and things like that, bank robbers, jewel thieves, whatever, aside from, like, the really high-profile ones that were, like, really powerful, you know, like the, you know, Italian mafia and things like that. But, like, when you hear about, like, a bank robber or something like that, if you actually look at the timeline, their like streaks were like always very short. Like, it's not easy to be a bank robber, especially whenever you become like famous for it. Like you get caught pretty fast.
I mean, wasn't like the man from Mars, wasn't he just like a summer? Or like maybe 2 summers?
Yeah, that's usually how it is. Like these criminals that you hear about, like their like streaks of doing these crimes are always like really short because it's just really hard to be a criminal that is like famous. Those two things don't go together well. Not famous, but like known. Like whenever it's like this guy is a bank robber and he's being reported in the news all the time. And he was just doing this for 3 straight years while he was a cop.
Much like the man from Mars, actually, now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. He bought himself a new house, which he lived in alone after divorcing his wife Leonie yet again in 1978. He also opened a souvenir shop with his buddy Carl van Deventer, who, just to reiterate, worked with the Bureau of State Security and didn't know anything about where the money to open the shop had come from. But the shop became a valuable tool to launder the stolen fund. Number one, everybody in the police force hates this guy because they think of him as like a daddy's money boy. They're just like, oh, this guy, like, fucking, his dad just, like, gave him this job. And they all don't like him. And this Carl van Deventer guy is, like, he's the only one who, for some reason, likes him and is his friend. And they're both cops, which I don't know how it works in South Africa, but, like, you don't make that much money as a cop. It's not like a high-paying job. And he's friends with this dude, and André just comes up to him and he's like, hey, want to open a shop?
A souvenir shop, too.
He's like, sure. And he's like, yeah, I got this money. And he doesn't think to question where he got money to open a business.
I kind of love it. You know, it's like Ozark, but make it South African.
There could be something fishy to that maybe he kind of did get it and he just maybe turned a blind eye. But we'll get to that. And André possibly could have gotten away a lot longer had he not made the classic mistake of thinking he could trust a narc. In December of 1979, a drunk André thought it would be a good idea to rope his friend Carl into his bank robberies. He even mentioned having a stolen car at the Jan Smuts airport ready to go for his next haul. Carl naturally said no, and André tried to claim that the offer was a joke. But Carl, perhaps being a somewhat decent law enforcement agent, decided to see if a stolen car was in fact at the airport. And there was, with fake beards and wigs to boot. Carl had someone stake the vehicle out until André got to it on January 3rd, 1980 to fly to Durban for a bank robbery. When he returned to the Jan Smuts airport, cops were waiting to arrest him. And he had a handgun and 4,000 rand on his person because, and this can't be stressed enough, airports truly did not give a fuck back then.
Can you just imagine what that conversation was like? Like if I came to you and was like, so I've got this business idea. What if we rob banks? And then you're like, no, dude, that sounds terrible. And then I'm like, yeah, of course, it's terrible. It was a fucking joke, broski. I can't even imagine the embarrassment of having to, like, try and walk that back.
First of all, this is not a joke. I'm not joking. If you tried to rope me into, like, a bank robbery thing, and you, like, did this where you, like, seriously came to me and, like, proposed the idea that we rob banks, I would say no, but I wouldn't tell on you. I wouldn't call the cops on you. Like, I don't give a fuck if you rob banks. You're probably going to get caught and go to jail, and I care about that. Like, I don't want that to happen. Maybe I would try to talk you out of it. But, like, I don't care if you rob banks.
I'm touched.
But now that we've talked about it on the podcast, now you can't.
Yeah, of course. But also, that's an easy fucking I would not turn you in, because we both know that I'm not the type of person that's going to go rob a fucking bank.
Yeah, but it would be funny if you did, though.
You know, it's so funny. I was just thinking about that while you were talking, where I'm like, I don't even know if anyone would, like, take me seriously. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Just like, get the fuck out of here.
It's just like, nah, dude. Nah.
Just get out of here.
Yeah, they're not even going to call the cops. They're just going to be like, you don't mean it.
You go in there with a fucking, like, semi-automatic gun, and you're just like, get the fucking money out. They're just like, go on, get.
Yeah, they just old yeller me out of the bank. I don't love you no more, Dave. I don't love you no more.
Just leave. I never loved you in the first place.
Here, take this $15 in tap card fees from my wallet, you old little rapscallion.
You clearly need it more than I do.
Dude, I have to say, when I went to West Virginia for this Mothman Festival, I kind of love West Virginia. It's fucking forest, like the whole fucking state, but also, I was not expecting the accents to be as charming as they were.
Oh, yeah. That region of Southern accent is, like, very pleasing to the ear.
It was so awesome.
I'm from New Mexico. I'm eastern New Mexico, which is very similar to West Texas. We talked about this in the Roswell episode, but like, you know, we have some Texas listeners that might be offended by this. But like, I don't give a fuck. I'm from there as well. So it's not like I'm like insulting like an other. But like, I'm not a fan of the southwestern southern accent. I think it's kind of grating. And it may be because I just grew up there, and you know, you grow up and you have adults being like, get on out of here. And you just grow to like hate that sound. But I don't love the southwestern end of the southern accent. I just find it a little grating. But then you get into Louisiana, and then you go out further east and you get into like Virginia. And those are some nice accents. André stood trial for his myriad of crimes, with the question above all others being, why did he do it? During the trial, André claimed that he grew disillusioned with the concept of law and order in an apartheid state. According to him, this came to a head when he murdered a child during the 1976 Soweto uprising. Quick history lesson. White and black people were separated during the apartheid era in South Africa. White families had access to greater opportunities and better amenities, while black families basically lived in slums. The Soweto uprising consisted of a series of protests from black schoolchildren in response to the introduction of Afrikaans as the primary language in their schools in the Soweto township, which was seen as the language of their white oppressors. 20,000 children protested against this and were met with heavy police forces. It's estimated that anywhere between 176 and up to 700 children were murdered by police during this opposition. As such, the Soweto uprising became a turning point in how many in the country viewed apartheid. As for Stander, he claimed that he was one of the officers present at the protest. And when civilians began throwing rocks at police, the cops did what the cops do best: unmeasured retaliation. They opened fire, with Stander claiming he was responsible for some deaths. In response, he became disillusioned with the white supremacist system and started robbing banks? Like a year later? Perhaps Stander's story could hold up with some kind of twisted logic. The only problem is that there's actually no evidence Stander was even at the Soweto uprising. Carl van Deventer was quoted as saying,
He was supposed to have shot 22 people, but I never heard about it. Don't you think he would have told his best friend about it at some time or the other?
Additionally, while several officers were charged or punished in any way for murdering protesters, André's name didn't come up. His name wasn't even found on any of the inquest forms. Now, it certainly wouldn't be out of the police's wheelhouse to falsify documents, especially if it was to protect a captain. But all signs point to André making up an enticing backstory, turning himself into something of a Robin Hood-esque figure who may have robbed banks but was actually rebelling against a racist system. Now, you know, everything that we've read about that story, it just seems transparently like there's just no debate about it, that he was just in court and he just like fucking spun a John McAfee-esque tale. But I actually robbed the banks because racism is bad. Like, it's just blatantly a fucking lie. That is not why he was robbing banks. Because he just like, kept the money. It's not like he was like distributing the wealth. He just kept it.
I kind of love the idea that he was like, but no, I had to launder it so that I could give it away accurately. Like, if I just stole it, then I would just be passing the crime on if I just gave it to people. So I had to launder it first so I could just gift it legally, right? No? Are you believing me?
But just imagine if in the mathematical equation of I'm trying to not go to prison, you think it's a better story that you murdered multiple black children. Like, that's the version of the story. Like, can you imagine? It's not like, oh, a cop like murdered black children and then tried to claim that it was in self-defense or whatever. It's the opposite. He's like, no, I killed those kids. Like, he lied about murdering children.
To make himself seem more sympathetic. Yeah, he was just like, look, I know I'm a maniac and I've been robbing all these banks, but I did it because I have a tragic origin. I was forced to murder a child. And everyone's like, wait, you did what? And he's like, yeah, I was forced to do it. I had no option, and it really changed my perspective on reality and just rewired my brain. And they're like, no. I'm not really concerned with your perspective on it. I'm just more concerned about the fact that there's a dead child.
Like, you thought that this was gonna work? Question mark? But also, as we're going to see, it kind of did? The tide on apartheid was turning by 1980, so perhaps he thought he could win sympathy points by tying himself to a just cause. Cops also typically don't get the best treatment in prison, so perhaps he was hedging his bets for his eventual sentence, which came on May 6th of 1980. André was sentenced to 75 years in prison, although that came out to only 17 years with some of the sentences running concurrently. It may have been the end of the line for anyone else, but André's reign of terror, or heroic crusade, however you want to think about it, was just getting started. Act 2. Whenever you're in trouble, won't you Stander by me? After being sent to prison, André Stander quickly befriended George Allen Hale, who had a history of stealing cars and robbing banks. When it came to anti-apartheid sentiment, Hale truly walked the walk. He was incredibly outspoken against the white supremacist system, which led to him robbing banks. Feeling as though as long as he didn't hurt anyone, what was the harm? André charmed his way into Hale's friendship, even referring to him as, quote, South Africa's most notorious. Hale actually backed up André's anti-apartheid views, saying about André,
He held the whole regime in contempt and thought banks were the very symbol of greed, duplicity, and exploitation. I hated the South African system, and as we were both bank robbers and both set on a campaign of defiance, we were ideal company.
This feels like one of those jokes in a cartoon or something. Like there's a gag in the Simpsons movie when they're wanted by the government and they escape the like dome that Springfield has been put in, and they stop at a gas station and they see their wanted poster up on the wall behind the gas station attendant. And so Bart sneaks up and he like draws like weird clothes on the characters and like mustaches and beards and weird hats so that it doesn't look like them anymore. And then they buy their stuff and they leave. And when they leave, a family that looks exactly like the weird drawings that he did come in. And the guy's like, hey, and he calls the cops. It feels like one of those jokes where André Stander was in prison just like fucking improving. He was like, yeah, well, see, the reason why I robbed those banks is because down with the apartheid state. And I hate racism, and I was robbing banks to get back at the government for all of the racism and the apartheid. And he's just like fucking making shit up. And then he gets put in prison, and his cellmate is a literal bank robber who actually did rob banks because he hated apartheid. Or, alternatively, a different guy who came up with the exact same insane lie while he was in court.
What are the odds, though, that he saw this guy's case and was just like, yeah, that guy. I'll just do what he did.
Yeah, he learned about this guy and he was like, oh, that'll work, even though he's in prison.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what if he's just like, well, if I have to go to prison, maybe I'll just be a folk hero, just exactly like this other dude. And his lawyers are like, well, don't you want to, like, spice it up a little bit and maybe put your own spin on it? No, I'm just gonna say exactly what that guy says. And they're like, well, you know, George Allen Hale is, like, in prison. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. I'm not too worried about it. And they're like, but you're going to go to prison. He's like, yeah, I'll be a folk hero.
That's not what this is about.
Yeah, this is politically motivated. Don't you see? I'm out here fighting the system. And they're like, I don't think you are. No, I am. Fighting the system. Right now.
I mean, it has kind of become the tactic. Like, if you get in trouble, if you do something illegal and you get in trouble, you just say that, like, you're a folk hero and like you were doing it because the government is evil. That's like a thing people do a lot now. It's like a very common strategy. Andrew Tate got arrested for human trafficking. He was just like, the fucking government wants to silence me. And everyone was like, yeah.
Yeah, fucking, what's the comedian that was charged with like serial rape and assault? That,
Russell Brand? Yeah. They came out with that documentary and they were just like, yeah, this guy fucking has raped many women. And he just put out a video on Instagram that was like, they want to silence me. And then he's good.
And yeah, and he's converted to Christianity now. He's just like, I fucking love Jesus, bro.
I think his life is better.
Man, that's depressing.
Yeah, it is.
I never liked that guy. I always had a weird vibe with that dude. If the movie Get Him to the Greek had been a success, they were going to greenlight a Casanova film, and he was going to be Casanova. I know we constantly joke that this is the darkest timeline. That is the darkest timeline.
Whatever your thoughts are on him or just his real life persona aside, that would suck.
Casanova is like my favorite fucking thing ever. And I can't think of anyone less capable of being Casanova Quinn than fucking Russell Brand. Maybe Michael Clark Duncan. You know what I mean? Just fundamentally not the thing.
He's like directly underneath Russell Brand. It's like Russell Brand and then just very close after him is Michael.
And even Michael Clark Duncan, I'm like, maybe. I could maybe see that. Maybe. Russell Brand is everything I don't want in a Casanova movie. Also, I don't know how you do Casanova as a movie. I know that they've been talking about it forever as a movie. I don't know how you do it as a movie. A, just leave it as a comic. B, if you have to adapt it, I feel like it's a TV show. C, Russell Brand, I don't know, man. I don't fucking know, man.
I mean, definitely not Russell Brand. I mean, it's just, I get the concept of what they would be going for with that, but that would just suck. Everything being said, though, who plays Casanova in a live action movie or TV show or whatever?
Well, the character's drawn to be Paul Pope, so it would be really funny if it was like a no-name actor and then they like fucking deep-faked Paul Pope's face onto the actor.
Yes. Fucking Russell Brand could never play Casanova. You know what it should be? Just a body double with a face deep faked onto it.
Yeah, dude. I would love that.
That's the real thing that real fans want.
I mean, frankly, I don't even know. Are there real fans other than me? Like, I don't know.
How fucking dare you? We've had Matt Fraction on this show, and you're going to sit there and act like you're the only fan of his thing?
Of course not. Of course I'm not the only fan. But I would subscribe to a Casanova Quinn OnlyFans. Just saying.
If Matt Fraction didn't never listen to this show ever again after that one time that he did, he would possibly hear this and be offended.
All I mean by that is that it's my favorite thing he's ever done. It's my favorite comic ever. But objectively, it's not Sex Criminals. That's like a bestseller. And he's been involved in a bunch of bestsellers. Hawkeye, Iron Man. Like, he's done a lot of big selling stuff. And Casanova is just, it's a little more indie. But that doesn't mean that it's not good. It's my favorite thing fucking ever.
Even if Russell Brand was like a squeaky clean person that never did anything wrong, that would suck.
Yeah.
The thing about Russell Brand is like, you could say he's funny or whatever, but like he's not like a good actor.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know who I would cast as Cass. I just know it's not that guy. I just know it is 100% not fucking Russell Brand.
I kind of feel like a younger Cillian Murphy could have pulled it off.
Yeah, I could see that. I could totally see that.
He's a little too old now, but
yeah. No, that's a really good idea. You know what'd be really cool is if they had like a, I don't actually mean these two siblings because no, but like a Jake Gyllenhaal, Maggie Gyllenhaal thing where Zephyr and Casanova would be real life siblings. That would be fucking awesome if there was a situation like that where they had either twins or just siblings in real life playing the two siblings. Needless to say, I'll wrap this tangent up by just... The new Crow movie is terrible.
Wait, you saw it?
I did.
What the fuck? We were supposed to go.
We were supposed to go, but somebody just keeps falling off the surface of the fucking planet.
I was going to suggest we go this week or next week.
It's not even in theaters anymore. What are you fucking talking about?
The pair became a trio with the addition of Patrick Lee McGall, with a grand escape being imminent. In 1983, Andre and McCall were in a waiting room to see a physiotherapist when they overwhelmed the guards and took their guns as well as the therapist's car keys. They made a break for it, hiding out in Johannesburg for several months while waiting for the heat to die down. But they didn't exactly lay low. They stayed at a Holiday Inn before renting a house in a wealthy part of town, believing the best way to hide was among the country's elite. They eventually went back to break Hale out, who had spent his extra months in prison studying for a trade exam. The guards transferred him to a testing center, with Hale later recounting,
I was doing a test at the Olifants Fontaine Trade Center, and heard André saying, "Come on, Alan, let's go." I look up and saw 5 guards lying down with André and McCall standing over them with their guns drawn. We ran out, jumped into the Cortina, and drove off with me in the back.
This is fucking nuts. I mean, I know it was in the 80s, but like, it's probably a bad thing that we live in such a like surveillance culture that the concept that you could escape from prison for any amount of time just seems inconceivable, because my assumption is that somebody who's like in the system and escapes from prison, like they're gonna be caught within days because of just, they're gonna go to a convenience store and get caught on a camera, and like there's no feasible way of escaping from prison anymore. That's probably a bad thing more than it's a good thing. But it's fucking crazy that they escaped from prison and then they were just like staying in a hotel and then rented a house.
Yeah, how did they rent that house?
They're escaped felons, and they were like, all right, here's first and last month's rent, governor. Like, that's fucking crazy. They weren't like hiding out in some flop house. They were in the Holiday Inn.
I know, dude.
Now André had backup on his heists. The group, dubbed the Stander Gang by the media, would hit up banks, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single day. Hale would later explain their code for these robberies.
There were rules. No shouting, no flashing guns, no planning, and no designer violence. In fact, the understanding feature of all the robberies was that they went off so calmly that they were actually mundane. The object of the exercise was not to terrorize people, but to basically get in and out as quickly as possible.
The Stander Gang lived in luxury. They had a house in the Houghton estate of South Africa filled with stolen luxury cars and sex workers coming in and out constantly. Throughout all this, the police had trouble fighting the growing positive public sentiment towards Stander and his gang. He was seen as a folk hero pushing back against an unjust system. And that's what I kind of alluded to earlier. Even though to me, it sounds just like a naked lie that he was robbing banks as a protest against apartheid, and just like laughably, transparently not true. And he was just robbing banks because he just wanted money and just kind of hated his life. And it didn't work in terms of the legal case that he had, but it actually worked in terms of like public opinion about him. Like, people actually were like, yeah, this dude is like a hero, which I just find crazy because it's just so obviously not true.
But I'm a hero. Sick.
I guess that's just like the power of like the game of telephone, because, you know, this is the 1980s, or I guess the late 70s maybe at that point. You know, they didn't really like televise court cases in the way that they do now. And there really wasn't just a whole lot of like media to the degree that there is now. So these people were like hearing these things secondhand. Like, somebody read a newspaper and then they spun a story about it, and then somebody heard that, and then somebody else heard that, and then, you know, sooner or later you have an actual grassroots movement for somebody that's based on a myth of a legend. The cops even tried pushing a story of Stander raping a girl, even though a journalist pointed out that no evidence of such an act took place. Still, some outlets ran with it. But at the end of the day, they were criminals, and there's always going to be one weak link. For the Stander Gang, that was McCall. Despite the group's desire not to engage in violence, McCall ended up shooting and wounding a woman in a gun shop. Stander and Hale decided to do some jobs without him, as McCall became too much of a liability. Trick Style, a bank teller whose name sounds like she should be a hard-boiled journalist in a comic book, later said of the gang,
"One came towards me, and the other one walked around the office and came into my cashier's cage and stood behind me. That was McCall. Stander put a big sports bag on the counter, took out a revolver and pointed at me, and said, 'Don't push any buttons or anything.' So, they must have known exactly how the alarm and security system worked. Strangely enough, I wasn't scared of Stander, who openly pointed his revolver at me, but McCall, who was standing behind me and had his hand in his pocket, who I realized probably also had a gun, I was scared of him."
Yeah, he had that Safeway energy.
Safeway parking lot Fight Club exhibitionist energy.
Yeah. McCall looked like he shopped at Ralph's. Just like pure, unhinged, shark-eyed death lust. The Stander Gang had plans to take their operation to the United States, but it was never meant to be. One of the call girls who had been at the house recognized the criminals and notified the police of their whereabouts. Stander and Hale were away when the police raided their home. Only McCall was there, and when the cops got inside, McCall was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Hale and Stander went on the lam while the cops raided other safe houses, and according to reports, they found photographs of the woman whom Stander allegedly raped at one such location. At this time, Stander was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where he couldn't help but get arrested for running a red light. He produced a fake ID going by the name Peter Harris. In the process, he gave the authorities his actual address. South African authorities were able to track Stander to Florida after learning the gang planned on sailing a yacht to Florida. They passed Stander's information to the American police, who were able to track him down. This is where André Stander's story meets its bloody conclusion. On February 13, 1984, Florida police staked out Stander's apartment when Stander himself rolled up on a bicycle. The cops recognized him and gave chase, leading to a physical confrontation where Stander got a hold of the police officer's shotgun after being backed into a corner. Stander aimed the gun at the officer, and the cop drew his .38 revolver and fired 4 times into Stander. He bled out and died before the ambulance arrived. But that's kind of badass that he got a hold of his shotgun somehow. I gotta admit, how did he do that? I don't even know what that means.
All right, you copper, give me your shorty.
Yeah, he just. But really though, he's in a chase with police. Armed police are chasing him. How does he get the cop's gun?
The other thing, too, is that he's on a bicycle, which makes it so much funnier.
Yeah, he's on a bike, and he gets the cop's gun. How does that even work? How did he do that? Hale lived large for a while, but when money ran out, he robbed a company in England for which he would eventually be imprisoned for 10 years before being extradited to South Africa and imprisoned there for armed robbery. Hale was released from prison in 2005 and began a new career as a motivational speaker. He even released a book in 2018 called Bank Robber: My Time with André Stander. Hale died on April 17th, 2020. Man, fucking robbed banks, went to prison, escaped, faced trials and tribulations, went back to prison multiple times, and it was the Rona that got him.
Bleak.
The legacy of André Stander lived on in the 2003 movie Stander, starring Thomas Jane as the infamous bank robber. The film largely leans onto the folk hero aspect of Stander's reputation. 10 minutes of the movie, we see the Soweto uprising where Stander kills a protester, serving as the inciting incident for his crime spree. The movie also has a scene where Stander apologizes to the protester's father, taking a beating for his misdeeds of the past, which is also unclear if it actually happened. And the film bears no mention of the rape accusations. This movie is just a fucking crime. The fact that they made a movie about this guy, and they actually, unironically presented him as the folk hero that he just claimed in court to try to get a lighter prison sentence. And they were like, no, this is the real guy. That lie that he improv'd in 30 seconds, that's what we're going to make this movie about.
Have you guys ever heard of Robin Hood?
I'm going to pull up the trailer for this movie.
How much do we want to wager that Thomas Jane is not even trying to do a South African accent?
Oh, it's going to be terrible.
But is he even trying, though? That's the question.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Probably not.
I think they're just not going to do it. I think it's going to be about, he's going to be a South African guy, but it's going to be he's a South African guy with American dual citizenship played by fucking Tom Jane, so don't think about it. Also, wow, 2003 Thomas Jane is Punisher era Tom Jane.
Robbery.
Right this way. Good morning, cowboy.
He defied the law he once served.
Gentlemen, is there a problem? Thank you for coming.
No problem. Police have set up a special task force. Gentlemen, we have graduated to task force.
He robbed the banks
It's empty. Fill it.
he once protected.
Lady, sit down.
Fill it up. When you start listening to good advice, you get predictable. Then you get caught. Fuck predictable. Let's do it.
Outsmarting the police. Again
That's completely outrageous.
and again.
So much work waiting for us.
To make this outlaw South Africa's most revered
A lovely woman.
anti-hero.
We've been robbed by André Stander, eh? Careful, they've got a gun, eh?
It's the 31st. Let's go.
Nice to see you.
Now, where were we? Pleasure.
Dirty fucking Harry.
You're dead.
That movie looks and sounds like a Lonely Island era SNL video sketch that was like a parody of a Guy Ritchie movie.
100%. It's made even better too because it has the Sabotage or whatever the fuck the Beastie Boys song is in the trailer, and they're the wigs and dye hair.
It looks like they're like crappy on purpose, like 70s detective costumes from the music video.
Yeah.
They're supposed to look like a cheesy 70s exploitation film. You were half right. He didn't do a South African accent. He did a shitty British accent.
Yeah, it's not good.
He didn't attempt a South African accent. He did a really bad British accent.
Tom Jane, I love you, man. You're the one true Punisher, but also, I don't know, man.
But also, nah, not that.
Yeah, not that dude.
As for Standard's only son, Ernie Amos, he became a gospel singer, releasing the album Run to You in 2005. And it seems he's mostly given his life over to religion, a far cry from his father's way of life. I guess we could get a little sampling of, it's not really too relevant because he's not really in the story at all, but we get a little sampling of Ernie Amos's gospel music. Got this bitch on Spotify. Oh shit. He's on the spots. He's got 38 monthly listeners, baby. And now he's got 39. So far, so good.
The beauty of your face, the glory of your grace, it takes my breath away, oh Lord. Just the sight of you.
It's so interesting how even if you couldn't understand the lyrics, the rhythm of Christian music is just so instantly recognizable.
Yeah, it has an unmistakable DNA sequence that you can't quite explain, but it's just there.
It's hyper weaponized sincerity.
Yeah.
Also, falling more in love with God is just like, is that really the way you want to phrase that?
That's very odd. Yeah, I mean, that's terrible, but, you know, that's not surprising.
Yeah, good for you, Ernie.
I didn't, think that was possibly going to be amazing, and then it was fucking terrible. Sounds exactly the way I thought it was going to sound.
Yeah.
In a 2005 interview, even Ernie suggested that André Stander largely did what he did due to a boredom with life rather than trying to pursue the noble cause of dismantling apartheid. So what is the truth? What happens when reality meets folklore? Ultimately, the tale of André Stander is about what happens when multiple parties compete to try to tell the best story. Was Stander a man tired of the corruption in the white establishment of 1970s South Africa and lashed out the only way he knew how? Or was he a guy who came from privilege and felt like carving his own path in life, separate from what his father built for him? For all we know, Carl Van Deventer could have lied about Stander never telling him about how killing a protester affected him to make Stander seem disingenuous. Where does it end? We largely know what Stander did, aside from the rape accusations, which are hard to pin down or verify in any way. But he did rob a ton of banks. The legend mostly comes down to why he did it, which is something the cops tried to do in response. Robin Hood, Bonnie and Clyde, the stories behind their actions almost supersede what they actually did. André Stander may not be quite on that level, as most people probably haven't heard of him outside of South Africa, or unless you've seen the movie, which seems unlikely given that it made less than $300,000 at the box office. All we can say is that André Stander did some bad stuff that may or may not have been heroic in a sort of roundabout way to actually stopping apartheid. After all, there's a reason people remember Nelson Mandela and not some guy who abandoned his son to rob banks.
I think the idea of a life defined by how well you tell the story of your life is a really interesting theme and somewhat terrifying, because it means that the legacies of the individuals involved are determined purely based off of their own storytelling and how well they can align facts to support an argument, as opposed to being judged by the deeds of a life externally. And that idea is fucking scary to me.
Yeah, I mean, and really, if you kind of want to break it down, like, it's kind of what this show is about. But, you know, it's similar to what was said in the Act of Killing documentary, whenever Joshua Oppenheimer was interviewing the one guy who was involved in the genocide. And he said they were in the car, he was talking to him, and he said, the war criminals are decided by the winners. And then there's also just like that legal saying, you know, if you're drafting, you're winning, which is basically like whoever is talking is driving the narrative. I think that there's a lot of different iterations of something like that. And it's because it's just kind of universally true, right? Like, people are fundamentally captivated by narratives. It's like an evolutionary thing. It comes from like the just tribal instincts of people. The way we're supposed to be socialized is we live in these villages, and we are attracted to charismatic leaders who are the ones that are going to protect us from the elements and the bad people and, you know, animals trying to get into the village or whatever. And so we are instinctually driven to buy into narratives by the best person. The person who tells the best story is the winner, and then we make that person the leader, and we let them control us and make the rules and protect us. In a modern society, that just carries over, and people use that and weaponize it to reshape reality around us in real time. And that's happening all the time, every day. And it's interesting whenever you actually focus on like a case study of it. And you're just like, yeah, this guy, he just kind of like, he did something fundamentally frivolous and selfish and kind of like inconsequential in a way. He just robbed a bunch of banks until that one woman got shot. Like, nobody even got hurt in these situations. He was just robbing banks. And I'm not saying that that's like no big deal or whatever, but like, it just wasn't really that crazy of a thing to do in terms of like being a criminal. Like Bonnie and Clyde, like, they fucking killed people. They were just robbing banks, and they were like really like low key, as they said, kind of mundane crimes. But he was able to just kind of like spend 30 minutes talking in a court case in the 1980s, and he transformed himself into a folk hero who got a movie made about him with Thomas Jane, which is extremely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the real question there is like, how much of that end period of his life where he was talking about anti-apartheid sentiments and saying, I'm robbing banks and fighting the system, like, at a certain point, how much of that initial spark of motivation coming from a duplicitous perspective even matters? Like, if the end result is that it's getting people talking about, hey, our society is racistly structured and we should reformat this, and you're doing the actual work of fighting the system of oppression by dismantling the banks, and you're literally doing that, you're not metaphorically doing that, even if the initial motivation isn't correct, that he started out doing it as an act of rebellion, at a certain point, does it matter? When is resistance versus when is performative resistance just actual resistance?
Yeah, like intentions versus impact, and like whether doing the right things for the wrong reason is even relevant if the end result is still a net positive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I feel like that would be a lot more clear-cut if like the results were more definitively a net positive. Like if it was just like, yeah, he was just like robbing banks and he kind of like lied and said that he was doing it for these like altruistic reasons, but it was very obvious that he wasn't. But also he like single-handedly bankrupted the South African bank system and it caused apartheid to end, or like that's such a grandiose version. But like if there was like a more clear-cut net positive result, it would be a way easier thing to evaluate. But even the thing that he claimed to be doing, and like you said, he was very literally directly doing, was like a very tangential thing. It's like you got to wonder the effectiveness of those climate protesters who go into the Louvre and throw chocolate pudding on the Mona Lisa or whatever. It's like, is this doing anything? Is this accomplishing anything at all? And this is just even more like transitive than that. What is robbing banks really doing? Because like these banks have like insurance and, you know.
You're right. I just keep thinking about the fact that, you know, like I said, the beginning motivations are obviously kayfabe, right? But at the end of the day, if he's sparking discussion in society to make things less racist, like that's not bad, you know? Like, but I'm also not necessarily defending him as a folk hero. Usually the stories that we cover have a little bit, there's like a twist to it, right? There's like a person presents themselves as X, but they're actually kind of Y. And when you think about it, that Y is directly in confrontation with X. And this story has an interesting permutation on that, where it's like, this guy's obviously not in it for the right reasons, but he's still doing the thing that everyone is using as the linchpin discussion point to dismantle the racist society. So at the end of the day, he's being presented as X, he's actually more kind of Y, but his end result is closer to X than it is Y.
Yeah, if it was more like less what he was doing and more like the symbolic catalyst he was serving as, where him doing that, people saw it and it was like inspiring them.
Yeah.
And that actually had some kind of iconographic effect on the hastening of the end of apartheid. Yeah, I could see that. And we kind of talked about that a little bit, that maybe that kind of did happen, where he kind of did serve as like a Robin Hood-esque figure that was actually inspiring people to increasingly have a negative sentiment towards what was going on in the country.
Yeah. That being said, your argument kind of falls apart when like your tragic origin is then I was forced to murder a black child.
Yeah. Then you go on to the other side of it, where it's like, I've mentioned this before on some other episode of the show, but like the People's Temple, the Jonestown cult that all just like mass committed suicide. Originally, they started out as like an anti-racist organization that was like dedicated to ending racism. And they staged protests and did like real anti-racist collective action. But all along, it was really less about that, and it was more about Jim Jones's like God complex and the idea that he wanted to be the guy that ended racism and be like a literal white savior. And then as he became more mentally ill and spiraled more out of control, as he wasn't accomplishing these lofty goals, he just became suicidal. And then he was like, I'm going to fucking kill myself and everybody because I can't be the white Jesus of the world or whatever.
Which is kind of interesting too, when you look at the kind of character arcs that a lot of these cult leaders have, where they all, as we've talked about before on the show and just interpersonally, a lot of these cult leaders have God complexes. They all have obsessions with race. They all have obsessions with class and status, power. And arguably the two most famous cult leaders in American history are Jim Jones and Charles Manson. And they're the same kind of guy with the same motivations, just in opposite directions, where Charlie Manson was convinced that, you know, there was going to be a race war and was a deeply racist person. And Jim Jones was like the reverse. He was like, we have to stop thinking of people as other and we have to accept everyone. And like, there will be no race war ever. Like, it's so weird.
Yeah, but also kind of equally, maybe not quite equally, but like fairly equally as abhorrent as Charles Manson, because he was that guy in that episode of Atlanta where he goes to his house and he's like the white guy and he has all the African art all over his walls or whatever, and he just condescendingly talks to Donald Glover's character about African history. Like, he was that guy, to the point where at his like craziest, he was speaking in a weird attempt at a black person impression. He like became black. In his mind, he was like becoming black. Well, Dave, I'm sure you were about to say something very smart, but we actually don't have any time, so let's just skip it.
All right. Spandrew, any final thoughts for this episode?
Yeah, I mean, the stuff I was saying before is pretty much my sort of philosophical final thoughts. But the one thing I will say is that it continues to baffle me, some of the stories that we cover, where it's like, how is this not something I already knew about? Because it's like objectively crazy that he was like on like an 8-year bank robbery spree, at which point in the middle of it, he escaped from prison. That's one of the craziest crime stories I've ever heard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how many stories about South African history can you name, like, that we get even exposed to here in America? It's like Nelson Mandela, apartheid as a concept, and then like Neil Blomkamp.
The only one that comes to mind is about that time that those street thugs adopted that robot and used him to start stealing cars from people.
Right. Or the time that spaceship hovered over Johannesburg. That was pretty crazy. Tune in next week for our Neil Blomkamp retrospective. And on that note, I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Spandrew Spice.
This has been Deep Cuts. If you'd like to find me on the internet, you can do so at heydavebaker.com, where you can find my book, Mary Tyler Moorhawk, Hellboy, not Hellboy.
Ha ha! You showed your cards.
Halloween Boy. Everyone is tuliping all my other books. And, follow me on the socials or whatever. Spandrew, where can people find you on the internet?
If you want to pay your respects to the dear beloved Papa Pricey, you can go to his website, dapricewrites.com, and you can get his book, Judge Dredd. Deadbolt, AI Private Eye. You can also follow us on social media by going to Facebook and searching Deep Cuts Podcast. You can search the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group, where we talk about the show and make memes and other cool stuff. You can go to our Discord server by going to bit.ly.com/deepcutsdiscord, and we talk about the show, make memes, play games, and other cool stuff on there. You can follow us on Instagram at DeepCutsPod. You can follow us on TikTok at Mystery Treehouse, and you can follow me on TikTok at DeadBoyDetective.
Deep Cuts is a production by Boy Genius Media. If you'd like to find this show and others like it, please visit boygeniusmedia.com or deepcutspod.com.
If you want to join in on post-episode discussions, please join the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group. Finally, subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional video content.